Hi folks, here with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about how we're looking at a non-market marketplace when it comes to real estate. Now, we've known for quite a while that the stock market prices are all controlled by the globalists. We're also seeing the globalists entering all sorts of other areas like energy prices and all that. But and a lot of what we see now is the marketplace is gone. It's cartels, it's oligopolies, it's monopolies in various guises and shapes and forms. So it's a real sort of banana republic thing that's happening. You know, you see all over South America, all these monopolies that are run by the cronies of whoever's running the show. But we're also seeing it in domestic housing. So what used to be demand and market driven and driven by the amount of money that was coming into the marketplace, this is now all set. And the globalists have sort of worked out a way of, if you like, establishing a floor under the retail pricing so they can jack it up, set a floor underneath it, and then everything is done off a minimum of that floor price, and they can increase it. So now, this wasn't immediately apparent. I sort of looked at this over a few years and thought, geez, this is really weird. But let me sort of talk about a few statistics and facts and figures, and we can just get to the bottom of this, or at least give you some understanding of how it's happening and the effect it has. Because as the real estate prices increase, and they're disproportionately owned by the big end of town, then the standard of living through higher rents and higher mortgage servicing costs, the standard of living of the citizenry declines, and that's and you know, to illustrate the point, you know, rents have increased, as indeed have mortgage payments, have increased at around 2.3 to 2.4 times the rate of wages. So now, in a dual income household, that's somewhat offset. Then in a dual income household, we're working full time, they can't really afford to have children. So we're paying at the other end, where there are fewer children being born like locally in the community, and therefore another generation of people isn't occurring, which means they then start to import black and brown peasants from offshore and so on. So there are various interrelated issues to this. But even if you've got two, you know, slightly above average incomes in the household, which means minimum of two full-time jobs. And if you look at the amount of households that have that income, it cuts in at about 25% of the workforce. So, you know, outside of that, you've got people who are making less than the average income, or they've got one income and they're below that threshold. Now, this means that they're spending you know, half or more of their income, and many people are, just on housing and shelter. That's before you get to transport and putting food on the table and the like. So these are very important issues, and so these prices being manipulated by the globalists, which are the big financial houses, this is a very important issue for the standard of living for everyone in the West. So, and it's particularly unique to the West, because if you want to go to a lot of these countries, you know, India and China and you know, all that sort of thing, you can't buy houses there. You have to, and there are some places where you can, but you have to pay a huge sort of like a holding deposit that the government effectively holds, and you can't sell it for more than you paid for it. So you can't profiteer out of it. So whereas in the West, it's all come and everyone piles in, and particularly again the big financial houses. So let me talk about a couple of things. Now, the first is there's a province in Australia, or a region in Australia, where the average amount of properties for rent, and this was sort of in the 12 months leading up to the COVID lockdowns and COVID restrictions. And this is an area that wasn't hugely hit by COVID. You know, the COVID effect was moderate rather than severe in this particular region. But the average amount of properties for rent, not for buy, but for rent, was in this particular province of Australia was about 40,000. Every week you'd look at it, it was around 39,300, 40,200, 39,900, 40,500. It was always around, hovering around that 40,000 mark, and seemed to for all the time. Now this is properties which is a mixture of apartments, freestanding houses, duplexes, townhouses, and so on. So it was the whole thing for rent. And this is going from 1-bedroom places to 15-bedroom places. So the whole range, and going from the very, very top of the market down to the entry level. Now, since COVID began, a lot of people who are renting have gone back to India and China, students and people that had finished their studies in Australia, but they are allowed to stay on, I think, for a 3-year work visa or something like that. And so they were working in hospitality and coffee shops and cafes, the Starbucks, that sort of thing. So doing all that sort of stuff, and they most of them went back because a lot of the restaurants were closed down or had very limited hours of opening and that sort of thing. So a lot of those people went back to India and China and elsewhere. So you'd think that the prices of the real estate, because most of them are renting, not all, but most of them, you think the prices of the real estate would have absolutely tanked, given there was this sudden surge of people leaving their rented accommodation. Now, on top of that, there was less money chasing the rentals. So most people that weren't laid off, and many people were laid off, by the way, because of these COVID restrictions, even the people that weren't laid off had a 20 or 30 or even 40% pay cut in order to keep their jobs. So that's quite a hit. I mean, if you're making the average income and you lose 20% of it, you've lost a pretty substantial portion of your net income. Now, you might save a bit because you don't have to, maybe you're working from home now, you don't travel to the office, so you're saving on, fuel for your petroleum for your car, or gasoline, as the Americans call it, or you're saving on the cost of public transport and so on. So there's maybe that, but even so, it would be a big whack on your income. Now, in spite of all that, the amount of properties for rent fell by remember, the average is 40,000 a week. Every time you look at it, it's 40,000 or about 40,000. The amount of properties for rent fell to 23,000. Now the average is now 24 to 23,000 a week. So that's a massive amount of properties have come off the market when there's less money chasing the properties and fewer people wanting to rent. And there's less, but the rents have gone up. Now, there's a few small pockets of total concrete jungles where you can look for miles where you see nothing but high-rise apartment blocks. Now, in a couple of pockets around there, the rents have gone down, but not by much. The rents have maybe gone down by 10% at most. But in most other places, and overall, rents have increased. So fewer people looking, so less demand, obviously, and these people have less money in their pockets, and yet overall rents have increased, again, other than a few small pockets. So now in some areas, rents have gone up from $450 a week to $1,000 a week. Now, what's a massive jump? That's more than double, and that's happened within 2 years. Places that are for rent for $550 an hour, $1,150, and this sort of thing. Nor are those situations rare. This is widespread. Now, this can't happen. The law of supply and demand doesn't work that way. There's fewer people looking, and they've got less money in their pocket, and yet rental real estate prices are increasing. And amongst the primary real estate, the better quality stuff, the rents can be 3 times what they were a couple of years ago. It's that serious. So where's this money coming from exactly? Now, this also means that there are huge swathes of real estate that are not up for rent. That is, people who own them don't have to rent them. They either can service the debts, the money they've borrowed, easily through other means, which means they're well cashed up, or the cost the cost of it is something they can offset against other income. But regardless of the reason, they don't need to rent it. Now, if someone's borrowed money, like an ordinary citizen, they've got an investment, maybe investment for their kids or something like that, they're paying the rent, they're paying the mortgage, and they've got to rent it. They cannot survive. Remember, their income's, either they've lost their income or their income's dropped by 20, 25, 30%. So they've got to rent that fucking apartment. But no, that's not what's happening here. There've been, more than 30, 36, 37% of all the properties for rent were just suddenly vanished from the market. Vanished, just gone. Now that means there's a lot of properties there where people just don't need to rent them. They don't need the cash from the rent. They don't need it, and they're not prepared to put the property for rent at a lower rate, which you'd have to if you had a mortgage to pay. You couldn't get 1,000. You'd have to accept 800 or whatever, but you'd have to keep on reducing it until you got a tenant in to rent it. But these people don't have to. So clearly they're not ordinary citizens, they're not ordinary investors, they're not just mums and dad investors. They're the big end of town that doesn't have to get, and nor do they want to affect the floor price of rent around this area, this province, which includes a large city, by the way. So this is this is incredible. The market is such that it is not responsive to any market forces or any known market forces. It is a completely controlled market, and that's something that we need to understand. Now, other things too. There are properties that are staying for rent, especially again, where the ticket price is high, staying for rent, that are up for rent. They'll leave it at the price they want for 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, 9 months. Don't care. They are not reducing the price of the rent by one. Now, again, an ordinary investor, like a mum and dad investor, they can't afford to go for 9 months without making, without getting a nickel in rent through the front door. They've got to accept a lower rate, but these people don't. They can sit on these properties, which in terms of property prices, they're ranging from $1.5 to $3 million range. So these aren't cheap properties. And typically, if a mum and dad investor buys that property like that, they've borrowed anything up to $2.5 million to buy, and so they can afford to pay $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month in costs and fees to hold that property without getting any income from rent. So this. I mean, you'd have to be not in the richest 1%. You had to be in the richest 0.1%, 1 in 1,000, to be able to afford that. And yet these things are widespread, where they just hang on for months without lowering the rent in order to get a renter or a tenant in. So that's one side. On the other side, I look now at a Rust Belt city, and this is in Australia again. Now, it was hit quite hard, manufacturing being sent offshore to China and India and whatever. So they lost a lot of their manufacturing, and a lot of these manufacturing jobs paid about the average wage. In fact, with a bit of overtime, a worker in a factory there could do okay for themselves. The real estate wasn't expensive in this city, or it's large town, small city. Wasn't expensive, and it was good value for money relative to incomes, and it seemed to be more or less market driven. The amount of expendable income, or the amount of income that the local people had, was reflected in the prices of the real estate, which means it was market driven. Now, after it was hit hard by again, all this offshoring and people losing their jobs, unemployment was very high. Now, there was only 1%, just less. No, I mean, it was a fifth of 1%. That's right, a fifth of 1% were in the top income bracket. Now, that's how poorly paid, how little money there was in this city. There was only 4% of the population made more than $100,000. That's another one there. So give you an idea as to just how poor this place was. The average wage in this city was 20% less than the national average. or more than that, 25% less than the national average. So that's how poor this place was, and it's got a poor sort of look about it. The street lights are cheap and they're on low burn. It just looks like a poor place. Yet, within less than 10 years, the real estate prices, this is real estate for sale, by the way, not for rent, although you could really say it was affecting the rent as well. The real estate prices for sale went up 400% in less than 10 years, 400% in less than 10 years, with fewer people buying, fewer properties for sale. Properties were staying longer for sale because it took longer to sell them. So say the average was 23 weeks to sell a property for, it went to like 38 weeks. And so there's less money, less buying activity. Places are taking longer to sell, but prices in that environment where clearly it was not demand driven, prices are going up by 400% without there being any demand. Now, what I noticed was that properties were coming up for sale and they were being bought and then held on to, and then rather than have people lower the price of the property, or the big financial end of town was coming in and buying up these properties, and they were using nominees. They weren't, the big bank wasn't coming up saying, I'll buy it. They were using nominees, flunkies and stooges to pretend to be the buyer, or pretend to be the real buyer. They're just fronting for the big boys to go out and buy these properties. So it prevented any price crash. And then they put a floor under the price and then nudge it up and nudge it up and nudge it up until you've got this 400%. The whole thing was an orchestrated scam to increase the real estate price. Now, if you're just a mum and dad with a house and you paid, I don't know, 100,000 for it, and then a little bit later someone says that's worth 400, you go, oh wow, I'm rich, hey, and so there's that effect. So people get suckered into that. Wow, I'm a high-powered, real estate magnate now, and so on. But the reality is that more and more of the property was owned by fewer and fewer people or big corporations, and they set this floor under the price. They're the ones that walked the price up to being that 400% level. So it became comparable to all the other places in Australia, even though the economy had the shit kicked out of it in this place. And there's no way the local people had the money to buy the property. The prices would have either stagnated completely for years or they would have gone down. But the globalists, no, we don't want this. Let's go in, let's control the pricing, let's manipulate the pricing, let's buy out whatever's on there, let's walk the price up so that this becomes a vibrant place for investors. And after we walk the price up, we can then sucker these Chinese communist, criminal goons to come along and buy it all from us. This sort of thing. So the whole thing was an orchestrated scam, and I think this is happening. Not just in Australia, but in various pockets around the world where you look at, the Chinese own half of Manhattan, for example, in the United States. So you look at these things going and realize the extent to which real estate, residential real estate, the homes that people live in, is where the ownership is contracting, so that there are people and there are companies out there, banks, big banks and so on, that own tens of thousands of properties that are out there for rent or withdrawn from the market in order to force up the prices. So they are deliberately entering the market to manipulate the prices to suit their ends. Now, nobody wants the prices of the real estate to tank to the point where people can't pay their mortgage, they're being thrown out on the street and so on. So by manipulating prices and holding that level, they're preventing a catastrophe. But they're the ones that created the situation for the catastrophe. They're the ones that have created this drama in the first place. So they're now stepping in to correct their own fuck up and are fucking up even more things, so that they're just kicking the can down the street and delaying the inevitable reckoning when the property must return at some point to intrinsic value. Now, they're even hoping to avoid that by saying, well, let's turn the world into a feudalist system where the aristocrats, as they used to in the feudal days, own everything, and the peasants just sort of rent from them. They don't get paid a salary or a wage. They just do what the fuck they're told and get shelter and food in return, and just damn well do as they're told. You've been with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for listening.